Hey, this is Benjamin Boyce, and I wanted to make public a mandatory training that Washington educators and most likely other state educators are to take. It's mandatory training, and this training is about transgender students, and I find that there's some quizzical leaps of logic that they make within this argument for acceptance. I have no problem with the acceptance and the respect portion of this training. It's the missteps of reasoning that they take in order to substantiate the transgender identity insofar as they do as something that is real. So let's dive in.
Every day presents opportunities to come into contact with people of different cultures, ethnicities, socioeconomic statuses, religious beliefs, sexual orientations, and gender identities.
So right out of the gate, a gender identity is put on the same level of importance as class, religion, and sexual orientation, and also whatever they mean by people of different cultures. Now, not all cultures are accepting of different sexual orientations, not all religions are accepting of different gender identities, and not all socioeconomic classes have the resources and the, cosmopolitan training to be as accepting of different identities as, the higher echelon, those who believe themselves to be of the higher caste or class. But it's interesting that they put gender identity, whatever that means, they have not defined that yet, in the same status as somebody's sexual orientation or class or religion.
That's why it's important for educators to respect the unique qualities each student brings to the classroom.
Again, I have no issue with respect and acceptance of difference, but that is a rather large shield that they will use in order to reshape society in the image of the transgender doctrine or the transgender ideology, which has some certain logical fallacies or missteps inherent in it, at least as they describe it here.
Unfortunately, some people's biases against others based on characteristics such as race, religion, sexual orientation, or gender identity may lead to behaviors that threaten the academic environment.
There's also, again, certain religions that have certain biases against certain races, religions, and sexual orientations. So not everything is created equal in here. Biases are not just free-floating. They are part of somebody's makeup from their past experience and from that which shapes them within their cultural environment. So it might be the case that this training assumes this completely pure multicultural existence where biases are just detached from any sort of reality, and they can therefore be dispatched because they don't have any root in somebody's belief system or their experience.
The term transgender refers to people whose gender identity or expression doesn't conform to the gender assigned to them at birth, or what a hospital might put on a birth certificate.
This is a linchpin to the argument, the gender assigned to them at birth. It's just this free-floating concept that is applied to an individual and has no basis in actual biological reality. The argument for this is based on an understanding that gender is something that is applied to reality and has no relationship intrinsically to reality. It doesn't arise from sex at all. It's something that exists in the mind and the heart.
Although many transgender students thrive throughout their elementary, secondary, and college years, they may face additional challenges that their peers don't. For example, a recent national study of transgender adults found that 77% of those who were out as or perceived to be transgender when in school reported being mistreated during their K-12 education because of being transgender. Just over half had been verbally harassed at school, and a quarter were physically assaulted at school for being transgender.
Could it be the case that this is owing to homophobia, so-called, or sexism, rather than just about being trans? Could it be the case that those who are trans or who become transgender over the course of their life, they decide that their gender dysphoria is something that they need to surmount by certain cosmetic and chemical means? Could it be the case that they have other personality traits that cause them to be ostracized? Does it always all have to be about this identity of being trans? If not, then it seems like they're building their argument first on the social construction and then on a sense of oppression, in order to facilitate a redesigning of how we perceive individuals and their sex and their gender. I'm not saying that that's bad, that we shouldn't participate in social engineering, but this is definitely social engineering. This is a pressure point that's put on teachers mandatorily through state institutions and through this training program. It's being enforced. It's being forced upon us, and it's not being labeled as social engineering. There's things that are happening inside of it that are not forthright.
17% reported that their treatment was so bad that they ended up leaving the school altogether. This hostile environment continued for many into post-secondary education. A quarter of transgender adults who were believed to be or known as transgender in college reported being verbally, physically, or sexually harassed because they were transgender. And 16% reported leaving college or vocational school because of this mistreatment.
Again, it could be the case that this is owing to homophobia or the reflexive or cultural dislike of homosexuals or people who violate from gender normativity. It could be about sexism. It could be about the expectations put upon men and women and how when people violate those, they are pressured socially to get back in line. And where does that come from? And to what extent do we need to dismantle all of that? The biases do not necessarily have to do with whatever it is to be transgender. It could be a complex, multifaceted origin. To interpret it only as oppression based on this transgender identity is to miss a large part of possibilities of where else it comes from. And how do we go about changing that or lifting up the biases in order for everybody to thrive is a very important question that I'm not discounting. I'm not discounting respect, and I'm not discounting the fact that, yeah, we could probably progress. But do we have to progress? Do we have to progress based on this sleight of hand?
As educators, it's our job to nurture the education of students like Sam, and the need to respect all students must supersede any feelings about a student's gender identity. We must also help students demonstrate respect and care for one another. Treating everyone with respect and civility increases students' ability to learn, be creative, make decisions, engage in teamwork, and build feelings of belonging.
Point of contention where they bring up feelings. What is a gender identity? It's not based in one's biology, right? It's based on one's sense of self. They'll get to that later. But before introducing the reality of what gender identity is, they say your feelings, as somebody who's a typical person or somebody who's in a position of power, are secondary. So there is a policing of feelings or a hierarchy of feelings as to what is real.
Most transgender people are known and treated as their sex assigned at birth instead of their true gender. When they begin to live as their authentic self, they may begin a process known as transitioning. This might include changing their clothes or hair, going by a new name, or asking others to identify them by a different pronoun. Some may alter how they look using hormone therapy or surgery.
If you have negative feelings or even confused or ambiguous feelings about somebody's so-called gender identity, it's your responsibility to control, maintain, and correct your feelings. However, what is that gender identity if not based on feelings? And who is to say that the person whose feelings are that they are in a different gender or in the wrong body or of a different gender don't need to be changed or modified themselves? Like, what weights that as to which is more real, which feelings are more real?
You may have seen the initialism LGBTQ or LGBTQ+. Additional variations include LGBTQA or LGBTQIA, with the A standing for asexual and the I representing intersex. That's a lot of letters, but the human gender and sexuality spectrum is vast.
The human gender and sexuality spectrum is vast. What do you actually mean by gender? And what do you actually mean by sexuality? And how vast is it? All these different identities is a big, large pill to swallow. And it inflates these identities with a value that's not necessarily productive for anybody to be so obsessed with your sexuality and your gender and where on this vast spectrum you actually reside. It leads to a bunch of eddies in consciousness where you're wasting a lot of time and not actually doing anything productive for your fellow man. It's just a lot of navel gazing. And I don't mean that to be disrespectful to the oppressions or the hardships that people of varying sexualities and gender identities so-called face. It's not about disrespecting the individual. It's about critiquing the ideology.
As language and society evolve, so do the identity labels people choose for themselves.
We are on a path of progress. Things are constantly evolving. The thing about evolution is that it's a blind process, and certain entities, let's say from a culture to a microbe, can just mutate in certain directions that are not necessarily helpful for that body, right? And then it leads to the end of that body. So not every mutation is an evolution. It's not. Not every experiment in the biological sphere or in the cultural sphere actually leads to a better society. Progress in and of itself could be off of a cliff or it could be up a mountain. You cannot append to every mutation or change in a society or organism with a good or bad value. You have to see how it actually plays out in society.
L stands for lesbian, a woman who is sexually or romantically attracted to other women. G stands for gay, a man who is sexually or romantically attracted to other men. Gay can also refer to anyone who is attracted to someone of the same gender.
Okay, so sex isn't real. The sex that somebody has biologically is not real. Well, it is. It's underlying, but has no real relationship to this thing called gender. This is, again, the gender matrix, where the only reality that we could ever actually have conscious interaction with is in our heads. It's purely cultural, and the biology, the reality underneath it, is kind of just tenuously connected to our imagination. So if you are a man who's attracted exclusively to other males, and somebody comes along and says, well, I'm actually a male, I just happen to live in a female body, then you would actually be committing some sort of intolerance toward that individual to say, I'm sorry, I'm not attracted to you because I'm attracted to the male. It's wide open to manipulation because it all comes down to the force that one can exude upon the conversation or upon these categories of identity and sex, which are infinitely malleable, or so they would have us believe.
B stands for bisexual or bi, someone who is attracted to people of the same gender and to people of other genders.
In the L is a woman who is sexually attracted to other women, right? So what is woman? We don't know. But G and B have to do with being attracted to other genders or to the same genders, right? Furthermore, B stands for bisexual. It should be called bigenderal now, right? Because that sexuality and that sex is decoupled from this rubric of what gender is.
T stands for transgender and, as mentioned, refers to people whose gender identity or expression doesn't conform to the gender assigned to them at birth.
Do you have an identity when you pop out of the womb? Do you have an identity yet? Do you have a gender? You have a sex, and that's perceived at birth and then put upon your birth certificate. And it's actually a very important category because it has a lot of very strong, powerful effects on you across the course of your life, not just culturally, but biologically. So how does your gender identity conform or not conform to what you were called at birth? Actually, that sentence in and of itself does not hold water. If you append transgender to somebody who experiences extreme gender dysphoria or has a lot of problems coming into harmony with their sex and then goes through different processes to alleviate that, then you have something to stand on. But just saying that you don't conform to what you were called when you were first popped out of the womb as a biological entity doesn't actually tie together. The entity that exists when they are first born is not a cultured entity yet. It actually needs to go through certain processes before it starts to manifest a personality and to internalize, let's say, their culture that they are born into. And that takes years to occur.
Q stands for queer, The term queer used to have a negative connotation, but it is now often used as a form of empowerment by members of the LGBTQ+ community. However, use this term only with friends in the LGBTQ community who are comfortable with it, and only when you are sure it's in an accepted context. If in doubt, don't use the word.
They actually never defined the word, so we don't even know what it is, but they're going to continue.
Q also stands for questioning. It's normal for young people to question their sexuality or gender or where they fit in the LGBTQ+ community. The plus sign signifies that LGBTQ+ is a diverse community that includes a spectrum of sexual orientations, gender identities, and expressions. Some may have no desire for sex, asexual, may have been born with the physical characteristics traditionally assigned to both sexes, intersex, may not identify as male or female, non-binary, gender nonconforming, or may feel their desires change over time and circumstance, sexually fluid.
Here is something that I find concerning. So if a identity or the awareness of somebody as a self and all the accoutrements of what that self is made of, including their so-called identity of a gender make or their sexuality, if that is incredibly malleable to young people, what happens when we hand young people this toolbox that is made essentially of constructs that are not connected to biological reality and say, okay, now you get to make up yourself because sexuality and gender are infinitely variable. You can be anything that you want and you can be in a constant state of questioning. Where do they find a place to root themselves and to build an understanding of themselves as participants in a greater culture? If children are incredibly influenced by their society and incredibly malleable, what happens when we hand over them all these constructs that just end up being about somebody's feelings that are not actually rooted in a external, objective, verifiable reality, but rather in this internal sense of self that is, one, always changing even for adults, and two, incredibly changing for somebody who's undergoing the process of maturation. In other words, how is this not kind of a form of child abuse? Is this actually healthy to foist this way of understanding identity onto young people? A lot of these young people pick this stuff up. They're not born with these ideas. They come upon these ideas. Now, there are certain individuals who have a problem with their birth sex that is persistent, and you can quantify it more or less, and you can undergo extensive psychiatric treatment for this. There's actual conditions that result in transsexualism or to the processes of alleviating your gender dysphoria. That I have no problem with, and I'm not questioning at all. I'm saying that now that we are exploding that and using that as the gateway into this, you can be in a constant state of questioning, and then furthermore, opening up them toward entertaining these ideas constantly and becoming obsessed with these ideas constantly. At what point in history has the adults in the room allowed the children to become so obsessed with such subjective and malleable mindset and then promulgate that and promote that in their training? I don't see that this is leading towards a good, healthy society.
It's important to note that many other specific identities can fall under the LGBTQ+ umbrella, such as pansexual, genderqueer, or non-binary. The commonality is that these students do not fit into traditional heterosexual notions of sexual identity or static, binary notions of sex and gender.
Okay, again, LGBT used to be about sexuality and rights. Then you add the Q, which they don't define, but it could be questioning. I guess you can use the word, you cannot use the word queer, depending on the context, but it explodes. The category of LGB and then T is exploded. What does it actually mean? It's an umbrella. It could be anything. It could be your sex. It could be your feelings. It could be your physical characteristics, what you identify as, non-binary, gender non-conforming. What does this actually mean? They're not actually defining what this actually means, because if they actually defined it, then we would have to actually evaluate it on its merits. Under what circumstances does the LGBTQ plus ideology make sense? It makes sense by means of saying that the reality outside of us, the objective reality, the physical reality, is subservient to our cultural identity. And our cultural identity is formed out of feelings. And then there's this patriarchy that's implementing or impressing us with these categories in order to form power relationships that we need to constantly disrupt and dismantle. This is inherently, if you actually look at the literature, if you go and you look at queer theory, this is about revolution. It's about upsetting these norms and these categories. That project is inherently destabilizing, and therefore the ideology doesn't have a lot of tools for stability in it. If you see how it spirals out of control, that it could be for anybody at any time, and you could be fluid, and you can go from one category to another, how is that actually good for young people to be involved in? Does that actually lead to a good life? Is this the path toward a good life? Is this the path towards understanding objective reality and being able to manipulate objective reality and to build a life of stability for yourself and your loved ones? Is that where it leads? If your goal is acceptance, we should first and foremost accept reality, and then navigate how to accept different people's personalities on top of that. But this is actually not about acceptance of reality. This is about the denial of reality and the supplementation of reality with this cultural, completely subjective matrix that exists first and foremost in our head and is built out of power relationships.
As Leslie found with Sam, gender isn't as simple as being born male or female. The sex assigned at birth is typically based on visible physical anatomy, whereas gender identity refers to how people feel and what they call themselves.
Okay, so if gender identity has to do with feelings, if that's all it's made up of, what is to say that the society's feelings about how you should act as a male or female are less important than the individual's desire to express themselves in typically female or male ways? If this puts us on the path towards accepting that there's variations in behavior and there's variations in personality and we should respect all of that, I have no problem with that. I have no problem with that at all. But the sleight of hand that they say that basically biology doesn't really matter. That which we can point to, that which we can objectively verify, doesn't really matter. What really matters is our feelings, and some people's feelings are more important than others. What do we do with that feelings? Should everybody's feelings go along with the feelings of one individual who's the outlier? Or should the outlier modify their feelings to be in accordance with the group? Who's to say if everything's based on feelings, whose feelings matters most? It's not the majority. In this instance, it's not the feelings of the majority. And if we need to be more accepting, I have no problem with that. But the command to obey and to conform to an individual's feelings, an individual, furthermore, whose feelings don't match up with objective reality, that sets us on a path of complete destabilization, more and more and more. Who has the power to enforce their feelings is the one who gets to dictate and create reality.
Transgender people are those whose gender identity is different from their sex assigned at birth. There's also a word for people who aren't transgender: cisgender. Cisgender people are those whose gender identity is the same as their sex assigned at birth. Most people are cisgender. However, research suggests that somewhere between 0.5 to 1.5% of the population is transgender.
Research suggests. If they are establishing everything on this sex assigned at birth, what they're doing, they're creating a division between the objective reality and what we put onto it, how we interpret that objective reality. And then they want to come in and say that research suggests. What is that research based on? If there's no connection between what we perceive and what is objectively reality, and you can just pick whatever research that you want, there's no way to actually verify which research is real or not because there's that disconnection already with reality. Once you erode that link, then you can't trot out research anymore. The research is always about projection. The research itself can never be verified because every verification will never line up with reality. Furthermore, they say that research suggests, right? So they are open to, there's some variables here, but how are we supposed to go along with this training and actually know how to behave if this is all subjective? If this has nothing to do with reality, if this is only feelings, and if I don't feel along along with this, I will be the outcast now. I am the outlier if I disagree. I'm not saying I disagree, but if I were to disagree, they would have the grounds to push me out because I no longer agree with this feelings, certain feelings. My feelings are of a lesser importance than the feelings of this special category.
When Sam changed schools toward the end of high school, he and his family saw firsthand how a positive, respectful, and inclusive culture can shape students' educational experience.
This child went from barely surviving to absolutely thriving because of the culture of respect that this school had. Their philosophy was educating hearts and minds, and they set a really high bar for their expectations of kindness and respect amongst everyone within the community, not just the kids. And everyone rose to that expectation. They knew they had to, or they were going to be asked to leave. And I'm not just talking students, or I'm not just talking teachers to students, I'm talking every single person within that school community. They were intent on having a community of inclusiveness. So that was also, it meant the kids to the custodians, or the cooks to the school bus drivers. I mean, it was anyone who interacted with anyone was expected to be inclusive. And in doing so, I mean, the culture, the difference was profound. And because of that, I mean, he just, like I said, he went from barely surviving to absolutely thriving.
That to me gives the clue to this, is that if it's all based on feelings and the operative principles are inclusion, respect, and care, then everybody has to accept everybody else's feelings unless those feelings are exclusionary. So this is such an inclusive environment that we will exclude anybody who deviates from a certain form of behavior, and that could be absolutely true and valid. I don't want to instantiate some form of disrespect or demeaning people based on the way that they act, other than, antisocial behavior. If you're being antisocial, that's a different thing than if you just express yourself with more femininity or masculinity, independent of your biological sex. That's not the problem I have with this stuff. It's that underneath all that inclusivity, it's that, well, what is this all based on? What is this identity, this gender identity, these sexualities? What are they based on? And once we say, well, they're not based on reality, they're based on feelings, and well, how do we have these categories of this and that? Then we say, well, it's an infinite spectrum of identity. It's an infinite spectrum of sexuality. Well, then why are we even thinking through this stuff? Why does this stuff actually matter if it's not rooted in the real, and then it's infinitely variable? Like, what are we really getting caught up in? I don't think that this is the proper path towards inclusion, because it's not based on acceptance of foundational facts and then building upon those foundational facts just basic values of respecting individuals. I have no problem with the respecting of the individual. That's not what's being slipped in through these trainings. Underneath that respect and that inclusivity is this ideology about gender and about sexuality that is not based on reality. It's based on feelings. And where does that lead us as a society? It leads us into this perception of utter subjectivity, utter relativity. It leads us into a nihilistic, very isolated form of only understanding ourselves as completely distinct containers of all these feelings. And even the language that we use to reach out to other people is very tenuous. So we have to force other people to agree with our feelings, but that eventually breaks and shifts, because how can you enforce feelings for everyone? How can you say that all religions are valid and all gender identities are valid if certain religions say that certain gender identities aren't valid? What happens when a school says, well, I have Muslim janitors, I have Muslim parents, I have Muslim students, and they disagree with homosexuality? Well, what do you do with the Muslim? They're not part of the dominant culture. Can you change them? Do you have the right to say that the Muslims are wrong in this completely subjective, completely relativistic worldview? How do you choose? Because eventually you're going to have to choose. Eventually you're going to have to prioritize whose feelings are more valid and should be respected more than other people's feelings and opinions. And if you don't have that solid basis in objective reality that you can verify, then what do you have other than assertions of power. It's very, very fraught. And I find that it being packaged under the auspices of care and respect is very, very dishonest. And it disallows people to actually investigate what is underlying all this stuff. Like you shoot it out there as these little packets of mandatory training that people have to get on board with. But where does that lead us down the road? What is it actually based on? And why can't we question that? If the Q means questioning, it doesn't mean questioning of the LGBTQ identity or the ideology. That's one thing that you can't question. You can question your identity, but you can't question identity, because that leads you to the path, well, what is this actually based on? It's based on assertions. It's based on poetry, basically. And some of it's pretty, and some of it's not so pretty. And what is the fallout of this? What is the fallout of this? What if a young female doesn't want to be in a locker room with a male-bodied person? You say to that female, your feelings are wrong because their feelings are right. Right? You eventually come to a point where you choose whose feelings matter more. And if the young woman doesn't want to be naked around a young male, they don't matter because that young male wants to be around or feels that they belong around naked women. That's the way it pans out eventually. And it actually denigrates females. Females come out at the short end of the stick because the male biology is very powerful. It's very powerful. And it will push male bodies towards female bodies. It really does that. I'm not advocating that, but there's a lot of biological reality to the drive within males towards females, towards getting with them by any means possible, not to get on that note. But so this is mandatory training. And this is how this ideology is being pushed onto teachers and then into students. But the students are also getting it from the internet too. Who designed this? What's it based on? I hope I gave some answers into how it actually operates, and hopefully I won't get some blowback for coming out against this. But is it the right of the state to be pushing this on teachers and then on children? Is this the path that we want to go? I think it has some problems if you actually look at it. So that's what I have for you today. I hope you are staying cool, calm, and collected, and I will check in with you as soon as possible. Ciao.